Continuing right along, it is my pleasure to welcome Jeff Marootian, Director at the District of Columbia Department of Transportation, and Michelle Boehm, Director of Transportation in the Office of the Mayor in the City of Los Angeles. Please join them in welcoming, in addition to my colleague, the Hill's national correspondent, Reid Wilson.
Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here, and I'm glad. Thank you so much to Jeff and Michelle for being here as well. I wanted to begin with sort of a broad overview of the two challenges that two of America's major cities face in terms of transportation funding. So I just want to throw this out to both of you. What are the biggest challenges that you all have faced in planning transportation and the future of infrastructure in the last few years? Michelle?
I think the largest challenge that we face is really explaining the value proposition to our constituents of what we're trying to achieve. We know that as we progress through this century, we have to start doing things differently, and we have to introduce more choice and more options and transform the infrastructure we have to meet our 21st century needs. And that is very complicated. We want our infrastructure to be greener, cleaner, smarter. We want our population to be more mobile. And in order to do that, we have to start introducing leading edge and sometimes bleeding edge ideas. And our ability to articulate that to our constituents tends to be the biggest challenge in moving forward, outside, of course, of paying for it.
Mm-hmm. I would echo that. Michelle and I had this conversation a little bit before this panel, and one of the things that I think is really interesting is that our priorities as a city here in the District of Columbia with regard to transportation and mobility really center around safety and sustainability. And I think those goals in large part align in many ways. Many of the efforts that we are putting towards our Vision Zero strategy, for example, also align with our sustainability goals in reducing carbon emissions. And so working to ensure that we're communicating about those things in a way that's clear, that we have multiple objectives that we think make the quality of life better for everybody is a daily challenge, but it's one that we embrace here as a city that's really trying to do a lot of cutting edge things within the mobility space.
Let's pick up on your comment about Vision Zero, and there was a question earlier about safety and reducing fatalities, both pedestrian and cycling is a part of my life at least. Speak to both of your city's missions in terms of reducing fatalities on the road through the Vision Zero initiative.
Sure. Our Mayor, Muriel Bowser, is deeply committed to Vision Zero. We have taken several actions over the course of the past 2 years to really reinforce our commitment to reducing fatalities and serious injuries, making our transportation system safer for everybody. And that includes large-scale projects, major intersection redesigns, changing the composition of some of our roadways that have functioned as highways for far too long, when they have residences and homes on both sides of them, and really trying to right some of the historic wrongs of our transportation system. But one of the things that we're also doing and looking and collaborating with all of our sister cities like LA are some of those smaller tactical improvements, investing in very simple infrastructure changes that have a lot of impact. And so those are some of the strategies that we're using, but fundamentally for us what it means is a complete shift in the way that we think about and communicate about transportation, all the way from my agency, really across the board to other agencies who have a part of making sure that people stay safe on our roads.
Yeah, Mayor Eric Garcetti issued an executive directive on Vision Zero. And so we've been working towards this, and all of those things are really important. Being able to take a look at what the infrastructure looks like today and start to make the changes that we need in order to make it safer. But again, a key aspect of this is behavior change. It's our ability to convince people that the public right-of-way is accessible to everybody and should be equally accessible to all modes of transportation, that the pedestrian and the bike rider have as much right to be on that public right-of-way as the single occupancy vehicle driver, and that it isn't incumbent only on the pedestrian and the bike rider, nor is it only incumbent upon the single occupancy vehicle driver to have a safe space to move in. It's incumbent upon all of them. And that's something that we're working really hard on in the city of Los Angeles, is making sure that equitability, that equal access is built into where we want to go in the future. And we're looking at that public right-of-way differently. You know, we have looked at the public right-of-way from curb to curb and just about what's going on in the pavement in the middle. We're now thinking about that public right-of-way from building edge to include the sidewalks too. And we're also thinking about it as a volume, several stories below and several stories above, because we know that as we want to relieve congestion moving forward, that we might be looking at things traveling in the air, and that we might be looking at things traveling under the road as well.
That's interesting. It sounds like you're thinking on a broader time horizon than maybe some of your predecessors had to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. As these new technologies come into, in these new modes of transportation, you talked about the choice that people now face. How are you working with these companies? How do you approach, the new companies that enter a space and suddenly there are new bikes or scooters or even mopeds, as I've recently discovered in my neighborhood, which is terrifying to me. How do you work with these companies?
Well, one of the things that we want to do as a city is we want to, again, make sure that all of these technologies are equally accessible to all of our constituents, that they aren't just in the entertainment districts, but they're really dispersed across the entire city in order to make sure that we are providing mobility equally. And so we want to be able to understand what's going on, and we have created some software programs and are using technology to track, if you will, the migration of scooters and mopeds and all of these types of things so that we know where they are in the city. And that is that's just emerging right now, and it's very complicated. The folks who are very privacy oriented are a little bit concerned sometimes about this, but we don't know anything about them other than where they're at, so that we can make sure that if there's a glut of these things in one part of the city, we have the ability to influence that glut and move it to other parts of the city so that we have that equitable distribution.
And I think to go along with that, one of the things that we have embraced as a city is piloting technology. We were one of the first cities to welcome dockless mobility about 2 years ago. We started it as a pilot program and saw where there were opportunities for us to really partner with companies to introduce technologies like Revel, which I know Frank is here on a panel later today. We're in the middle of a pilot right now with Revel mopeds, and we want to embrace those kinds of technologies. The only way that we're going to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips is by providing as many options to people across our entire city, but then also building the right infrastructure to facilitate that type of movement. And so while we're electrifying our bus fleet, for example, we're also building dedicated bus lanes. We're reimagining some of our largest corridors like K Street Northwest to include a dedicated transit way down the center of it, along with dedicated bicycle infrastructure, really providing what we need in order to accommodate these technologies that we've heard that our residents would like to use.
You mentioned the dockless bikes, and you helped pilot the Capital Bike Share program as well, which is a docked bike. Tell me about the difference between the two. Have you noticed advantages or disadvantages between the two?
Well, it's been fascinating to watch the technology evolve, and fundamentally we embrace dockless mobility as a way to get more people riding bikes and using that kind of technology. And so we have found it to be very additive to our bike share system. We run a very popular Capital Bike Share system. It remains incredibly popular. We get requests every day for new stations in new locations, and we think that's great. So the two things operate well together.
Gotcha. You also mentioned electrifying the bus fleet, and Michelle, I know that's been a priority of Mayor Garcetti's. Talk about sort of what difference electrifying the bus fleet in Los Angeles is going to have on transit in the future.
Well, that's something that we're very hard at work at, both at the county level and at the city level. We will be ordering the most electric buses that have ever been ordered here coming up. But one of the things that we have found, of course, is that then is complementary to the things that our utilities are doing to make their grids more resilient, and that we have to partner with them to make sure that we have that access to energy across the city in order to be able to run those bus fleets. So that is something that we are actually very excited about. We're getting ready to release what we call a next-gen bus operations update. So we are going to be deploying our buses differently in coming months than we have ever done that before in order to start to increase the ridership. But it has been complicated because you're getting that cross current between what sometimes are different entities, the energy sector versus the transportation sector. And really, the 21st century is kind of about how all of those things slowly come together, and we figure out how we complementary plan in order to deploy them. Because our utilities, of course, are faced with modernizing as well, and some of those other things. So that's been really the coordination point that has been really important in our ability to chart a course to be 100% electric in 2030.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a lot about the future and what's coming. Both Los Angeles and Washington have existing infrastructure, especially in the subways, that have faced challenges in recent years, right? How much of your attention do you feel is focused on improving the old versus planning for the new?
Well, of course, you have to do everything.
Sure.
And so we are just finishing actually an upgrade of our first light rail line, the blue line, and so we are going to be opening that in the month of October. It is basically a cash flow issue, right? You've got to be very conscious of the funding that you have coming in, and you've got to make sure that you're deploying it in the appropriate way to manage the services that you're running, as well as plan the new one. We've been very successful in LA County because our residents really understand what a challenge getting to the mobility that they envision is. And so we've been able to go out and get our taxpayers to vote for money to reduce the challenge. I mean, I think most of you probably think of Los Angeles. Traffic is actually a character in Los Angeles, right? If you think about Saturday Night Live, if you think about movies, they actually refer to traffic as a character. And that milieu that we live in has enabled us to get more tools to fix it than most other parts of the country. But it is complicated because if we just start building and we don't keep operating, we will lose the benefit of that program. So we are constantly balancing that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, we are both planning for our current needs, but also anticipating what some of the future needs might be for our city. And again, that's with a focus on ensuring that we are really taking the policy lead on what we want that future to look like. So we've got companies like Ford and Argo AI testing right now in the District of Columbia, and we're really observing closely to get a better understanding of what autonomous vehicular needs might be, but also looking to inform and shape how we want to see those things operate in our city. Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to the sort of disruptive companies that have come in. One of the things I'd love to know, have your offices evolved to have sort of separate teams that are liaising with these specific companies as they come in?
Yes, we in the past year and a half, we have stood up new divisions at DDOT to work closely with dockless mobility companies, but also to really rethink how we're doing planning. We created a division just to work on transit priority planning to accelerate the rate at which we are deploying dedicated bus infrastructure, for example. That type of activity really requires dedicated attention and energy. And the only way to do it is to have the appropriate staff who have the capacity and the support to get it done.
Absolutely. So we have an Office of Economic Development, we have an Office of Innovation, we have an Office of Sustainability. We have stood up one incubator right now, which is focused on electrification. We are planning for additional incubators to focus on automated vehicles and other types of new technology moving forward. So we understand that solving this is really a public-private partnership in any way that actually plays out, and there's so many ways. You know, there's a joke in that industry: if you've seen one public-private partnership, you've seen one public-private partnership. And so we really need these partnerships, these folks that are at the cutting edge and bringing technology to us to move forward. And we want to be the place, the city, where everybody wants to beta test technology.
Mm-hmm. What sorts of conversations have you had about this emerging trend of the micro-mobility, whether it's the scooter or the dockless bike or something? How do you balance the need for them versus limiting simply a flood of new technology coming in?
I would say for us, it's been very much an iterative process. When we launched a dockless mobility pilot, we wanted to see what the universe of technology was, but do so in a managed way. And in some cases, the market has really helped us shape that. But we have, more than anything, really listened intently to the public. We have gotten a lot of public feedback about the several iterations of our pilot program and used that feedback to help shape how we take it. And by and large, I think we've been able to do so in a way that people have gotten more and more comfortable with over time, and where we've established a good mutual understanding with the companies about what we expect in order to allow them to continue to operate in the city.
So we are currently operating, although we aren't, but currently operating in the city of Los Angeles is the largest dockless fleet in the world. And we took a look at that and understood that we needed a data specification, as I mentioned earlier, in order to make sure that we could take a look at how that was being deployed and track that over time and make sure that it was equitably deployed across the city. So we then were able to bring on consultants to help us create this data specification, and we've now made it available to all cities through the Open Mobility Foundation so that every city has access to this and can take down this program and tinker with it to meet their needs, understanding that this is critical for all jurisdictions in terms of embracing this particular technology, which really has provided a very wonderful first last mile solution that nobody could have envisioned probably 10 years ago.
I'm going to ask one more question and then turn it over to the audience for any questions from there. But as you look to this future that is now sort of a broader horizon than any of your predecessors probably had to deal with, what are the roads going to look like in 10 years or 20 years?
Go for it.
I'll go. So hopefully they're greener, they're smarter, they provide mobility in a different way, but the equivalent service to what people expect from our roads. And I mentioned it earlier, we're looking at our roads as being building to building, right? So that mobility highway, if you will, includes the sidewalks, right? Because it includes walking, it includes micromobility, it includes transit. We would hope that we have fixed guideway assets in our largest, most frequently traveled highways, but that we have deployed automated vehicle technology, that they're electric, that they're cooler, right? That they're basically everything. You know, our right-of-way needs to save the world. And what we do to convert it in order to do that is really the goal of the next 10 years.
And I would just add to that, the one thing I consistently hear at public meetings and in town halls all the time is safety is the most important thing that people, our residents, want to see in their streets. And so we're doing everything that we can to, on top of what Michelle said, to ensure that safety is really the component that we're incorporating into all of our roadways, irrespective of the technological future. And along with that, we're doing some things to get people thinking that way. So we've got our first Open Streets event happening here in the district in just a couple weeks on Saturday, October 5th. I would encourage anybody who's here to participate in that as we really try to capture people's imagination about what our streets could look like.
All right. Questions from the audience? Let's start with the gentleman in the back, then Steve, I'll come to you. Right back here.
Here?
Yeah.
Great panel. Bill Cunningham, Create Investor Research. Can you talk about the social equity issues and how all this new technology sounds great. We're in a city that has the highest rate of black women dying in childbirth, and yet you have a light rail system, a park with a bridge on it, in a ward that doesn't have a hospital. So as you look at these policies, and again, going back to the 1619 article, which talked about the impact of these transportation policies on segregating communities, how are you dealing with those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that that I think about every day. In all of our efforts at the direction of our mayor are really designed to ensure that the transportation future that we're building is as equitable as possible across all 8 wards of the District of Columbia. And so that's why we're taking steps to expand our circulator bus system to create new routes that serve parts of the city that have not had that service. And while we're also ensuring that as we're piloting technologies that we're talking about, that we're requiring as one of the many terms and conditions of companies' ability to operate, that we're requiring them to have equitable deployments across the district. And really, as we think about all of the work that we're doing, we're ensuring that we're focusing that work equitably, but we're also looking where the highest need is. And to your point, and I could talk a lot about the way in which we are having to really reimagine some of our roadways, some of those that, as I mentioned earlier, really function as highways in places that it's totally not appropriate for them to function as highways. That design was intentional many years ago. We're working to try to correct for that. It's a significant investment of resources and energy, but it's the investment that we need to make as a city.
All right, I got time for one more. Steve, just be loud.
I can give myself a couple more minutes. No, I'm just saying. Steve Clemens with The Hill. Great, really great panel. I have become an addict since I've joined The Hill 6 months ago of Capital Bike Share. And so
Great.
I ride it everywhere and go all over town, and I get this little click, this data that says, God, you just went this far, and you just burned this many calories. And so I guess part of when I think about the future of mobility, I'm really interested in the data offsets. And to a certain degree, as you get a more wired place, we're going to have folks from Qualcomm and others up here, sort of looking at a, measured, censored world that you get to attack waste in very different ways. What and you may have addressed this, but what I'm sort of, as a journalist, interested in is, as you succeed in LA, or you succeed here in creating different transportation modalities, I find the data that I'm getting on Capital Share not available in looking at the aggregate offsets in carbon emissions or things like that. And I'm wondering, I think there's a communications problem in your area, and I'm wondering how you're addressing that so that we see either less cars on the road or, and then just one little corollary to this, and I don't know if it's true, but I've talked to the scooter people and, all these little scooters everywhere that are burning, but there aren't that many actually. I mean, people think there are a lot, but you guys have a cap on them, I understand. And I'm interested in why you have a cap. Why aren't you expanding that much more dramatically and getting quicker transitions? So,
So I'll just address the second part, and then specifically with regard to things like scooters, we actually are increasing those caps. We just yesterday put out updated terms and guidelines for the future of the program, and that includes more capacity for companies to scale up. We've done so. What's that? I can't recall the specifics, but it allows companies to provide, if they meet our terms and conditions, to add more capacity. We also, Steve, have a number of new technologies, the sort of next versions of scooters and other types of electric bicycles that are coming to us every single day, and we want to create a space for them to operate as well, and to let our residents and visitors really decide which ones they want to see to continue to operate in our city.
We definitely want to leverage technology in ways that we haven't done it. We think that the private sector is doing a pretty good job of trying to make their business practices more efficient by using data, and that we need to transfer that to the public sector. Because by using technology, we can actually do maintenance and operations of our fleets more efficiently, potentially, than we're doing today. As you note, we can communicate more clearly to the public the benefits and the value proposition of what we're looking at, so that it's not, people aren't throwing their hands up saying, oh, now I'm spending, X amount more time trying to get from point A to point B, and you could say, no, it's 10 seconds. Wouldn't you add 10 seconds or take 10 seconds away from your day to save a life? For instance, if putting in new signal timing is something that you need to do at an intersection where there's been injuries in the past. So we are definitely working towards that, but in government, that takes a little bit of time. We've got to buy all these new systems to churn this data, and we need your encouragement to continue to do that.
All right, Jeff and Michelle, thank you both so much for taking the time. Thank you all.